Good evening and welcome back. Settle in, lower the lights if you like. There is nothing here you need to do tonight. Only listen and let the world grow quiet around you. Tonight we return to the far north, to a place that is not quite land and not quite sea. A single point at the very top of the world where every direction is south, and where the ground beneath your feet is nothing but frozen ocean, drifting slowly on the dark water below. Men gave their fortunes, their health and their lives to stand upon that one shifting spot. And when at last two of them claimed they had, the world could not decide which of them to believe. This is the story of the race for the North Pole. The North Pole and the South Pole are nothing alike. The South Pole sits in the heart of a vast frozen continent, solid rock, buried under ice a mile and more deep, a place you can stand upon and mark and walk away from. The North Pole has no land beneath it at all. It lies in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, far from any shore, on a thin and restless skin of sea ice that is forever cracking, grinding and drifting with the currents below. Stand at the North Pole and within the hour the ice has carried you somewhere else. Plant a flag there and by morning it has wandered away across the frozen sea. To reach the pole then is to reach a place that will not hold still to be reached. And to know that you have reached it at all, you must be able to measure your position on a featureless white plain, with the sun low and circling, where every landmark is the same as every other, which is to say, none at all. For a long time, men did not even understand the nature of the place. There was a strange and stubborn belief, held by serious and learned people for the better part of a century, that if a ship could only batter its way through the ring of pack ice that guarded the Arctic, it would break out at last into an open ice-free sea at the very top of the world. A warm polar ocean, they imagined, kept thawed by the endless summer sun, where a vessel might simply sail to the pole as easily as crossing a bay. They called it the open polar sea. Maps were drawn of it. Learned men argued for it, and ship after ship went north to find it. They found only more ice. The pack closed around their wooden hulls and held them fast through the long darkness of the polar winter. Some ships were crushed and swallowed whole. Some crews struggled home across the floes, half-starved. Some never came home at all. The open polar sea was a phantom, a beautiful idea with nothing beneath it, and the men who chased it paid the price in full. For the pole itself drew men as surely as the passage ever did, and it killed them just as readily. The first to make a true attempt upon it was the same William Peary who had pushed so far west in search of the passage. In 1827 he tried a daring new idea: to leave his ship at the edge of the ice and travel the rest of the way north on foot, dragging boats that could be sledged across the floes and rowed over the open leads. He and his men hauled north for weeks and reached a point further north than any human being had yet stood. And then they made a bitter discovery. The vast field of ice they were marching across was itself drifting south, carried by the current beneath it, at times faster than they could walk. They were labouring north all day, only to be swept back south in the night. At last, exhausted and defeated by the sea itself, they turned around. The record they set that day would stand unbeaten for nearly 50 years. The Americans took up the chase, pushing their ships up the icy channels between Greenland and the islands to the west, still chasing the dream of that open sea. And their stories grew darker the further they went. On one expedition, the commander, a man named Hall, died suddenly and in great agony, convinced in his final days that he had been poisoned by his own officers. And when that same ship was later caught in the breaking ice, half her company were carried off on a drifting floe, separated from the rest, and survived an astonishing 6 months adrift on that slowly shrinking raft of ice, living on seals and on what they could catch before they were plucked from the sea alive at last. Darkest of all was the fate of the Greely expedition. 25 American soldiers and scientists went north to a station on the far Arctic coast to gather knowledge for the world. And then their relief ships failed to reach them, not once, but 2 years running. As their food ran out, they retreated south to a barren spit of rock called Cape Sabine, and there they settled in to wait out a winter and to starve. One by one they died of hunger and cold and scurvy through the long darkness, while the survivors grew too weak even to bury them. When rescue finally came, only 6 of the 25 were still alive, barely, among the bodies of their friends. There were whispers afterward of what the living had been driven to do, to stay that way. It was the Franklin tragedy all over again, in miniature and within living memory. And then there was the strangest dream of all, to reach the pole not over the ice, but above it. In 1897, a Swedish engineer named André and 2 companions climbed into the wicker basket of a great hydrogen balloon on a lonely Arctic island and lifted off to float across the top of the world upon the wind. They were never seen alive again. The Arctic kept their secret for 33 years, until, by pure chance, a passing expedition stumbled upon their last camp on a frozen shore and found their bodies and their diaries, and even the undeveloped film still in their camera, which gave up its ghostly pictures after 3 decades in the ice. From those photographs and journals, the world pieced together the end. The balloon had come down on the ice after only a few days aloft, and the 3 men had walked for months across the floes and had very nearly reached safety before the cold took them one by one. This was the company that Nansen and Peary were about to join, a long sombre roll of the brave and the lost. The pole did not give itself up cheaply, but out of one of those disasters came the strange and accidental clue that would change everything. In the year 1879, an American ship sailed north into the ice off the coast of Siberia. Her name was the Jeannette, and she had been fitted out with the fortune of a newspaper baron, hungry for the headlines that the conquest of the pole would bring. Her captain was a young naval officer named George DeLong, and he carried with him the great fashionable theory of the day, that a warm ocean current flowing up from the Pacific would carry his ship through the ice and on toward the open polar sea. The current did not carry the Jeannette to the pole. The ice took her instead. For nearly 2 years, she lay locked in the pack, drifting helplessly wherever the floes chose to go. Her crew waited and watched and hoped through one winter and then another, while the ice carried them slowly this way and that, but never to the open water they had been promised. And at last, in the summer of 1881, the pressure of the ice grew too great, and the floes closed in and crushed her and stove in her sides, and the Jeannette went down beneath the ice that had held her so long. Her men were left on the frozen sea, hundreds of miles from any living soul, with 3 small boats and what they could drag. What followed was an ordeal almost beyond telling. They hauled their boats across the broken, heaving ice toward the distant coast of Siberia, week after brutal week. And then, reaching open water at last, they sailed for the mouth of a great Siberian river, the Lena, hoping to find native villages there. A sudden storm scattered the 3 boats. One was lost with all hands. The others reached the desolate, frozen delta separately, and there, in that endless waste of reeds and ice, DeLong and most of his party slowly starved and froze to death, while a few of the strongest stumbled on and found help and lived. DeLong's last act was to keep his journal, noting each death in a fading hand, until he set it down at the end and died beside it. Of the 33 who had sailed, only 13 came home. It was a familiar kind of Arctic tragedy by then. But what happened 3 years later was extraordinary. Relics from the Jeannette, papers, clothing, a list of her crew, unmistakable wreckage, were found frozen into a drifting ice floe on the coast of Greenland, on the far side of the entire Arctic Ocean, thousands of miles from where she had gone down off Siberia. Think on what that meant. The ice that had crushed the Jeannette had not simply sat still. It had drifted slowly, steadily, all the way across the top of the world, from Siberia, past the pole and down to the shores of Greenland, carrying the broken pieces of the ship with it. There was a great river of ice flowing across the polar sea, and one young Norwegian, reading the news of those Greenland relics, saw in them an idea that everyone else had missed. If the ice flowed across the pole all on its own, then a ship did not need to fight it at all. A ship needed only to surrender to it. His name was Fridtjof Nansen, and he was unlike any explorer who had come before. He was a scientist, an athlete, a champion skier, and a man of fierce and original mind. He had already made himself famous by doing something everyone said was impossible: crossing the great ice cap of Greenland from one side to the other on skis, with a tiny party and no line of retreat, burning his bridges so that the only way to live was to go forward. It had been a near thing. He and his 5 companions had crossed that endless white desert with the autumn closing around them, hungry and frostbitten, hauling their own sledges, navigating by little more than the sun and their own stubbornness. They had reached the western coast almost too late in the year to be taken off, and Nansen had wintered among the Inuit of Greenland, living in their houses, eating their food, watching how they moved and dressed and survived. He came home having proven not only that Greenland could be crossed, but a deeper thing, that the way to master the Arctic was to stop fighting it, and to learn instead from the people who had always called it home. It was a lesson he would carry north again. And now he turned his mind to the pole and to the puzzle of the drifting ice. His plan was so daring that the older, wiser heads of the exploring world declared it madness. He would build a ship and sail her into the ice off Siberia, to very nearly the spot where the Jeannette had been lost, and then deliberately allow her to freeze fast in the pack. And he would let the great drift carry her, locked in the ice, across the polar ocean toward the pole for however many years it took. The danger everyone pointed to was obvious. The ice had crushed every ship that had ever dared it. So Nansen had a ship built that the ice could not crush. He worked with a brilliant shipwright named Colin Archer, and together they built something the world had never seen. They called her the Fram, a word that means forward. She was small and immensely strong, and rounded and smooth in the hull, shaped almost like a bowl or the half of an egg, so that when the floes pressed in against her from either side, they could find no flat surface to grip. Instead of being crushed between them, she would simply be squeezed upward, lifted like a wet seed pinched between two fingers, to sit safely on top of the ice while it carried her along. She was stocked to keep a small crew warm, fed and sane for 5 years in the dark if need be. In the summer of 1893, the Fram sailed into the ice and Nansen let her freeze in. And the drift took hold exactly as he had foretold. Month after month, year into year, the icebound ship inched her way north and west across the frozen sea. The crew of 13, under their steady captain Otto Sverdrup, waited out the long polar nights in warmth and good order, reading, working at their science, keeping careful watch on the slow, miraculous drift that was carrying them a little each day toward the top of the world. But Nansen came to see that the drift, for all its wonder, would not quite pass over the pole itself. It would carry the Fram near and then begin to swing away. And so he made a bold and lonely decision. He would leave the safety of his ship and go for the pole on foot, across the moving ice. With a single companion, a strong, capable young man named Hjalmar Johansson, Nansen set out with dogs, sledges and kayaks lashed across the sledges for the open leads. They left the Fram and her crew behind to continue their drift, and the two men struck out north, alone, toward the pole. It was a brutal journey and a strange one. The drifting ice fought them at every step. It broke into pressure ridges they had to haul the sledges over, and into channels of black open water they had to ferry across in the kayaks. Worst of all, the whole frozen sea beneath them was itself drifting south against them, so that some nights they lay down exhausted, having gained a few miles, and woke to find the ice had carried them backward in their sleep, nearly as far as they had come. At last, with the way ahead, a chaos of broken floes and the brief season turning against them, Nansen knew they could go no further. They had reached a point further north than any human being had ever stood, closer to the pole than anyone in all of history, beating the old record by a great margin. And still the pole lay far beyond them, out of reach. They turned back. Now came the hardest part of all. They had no ship to return to. The Fram had drifted on, they knew not where. They had to find their own way back to land, alone, on foot and by kayak, across the moving sea, with no one in the world who knew where they were or whether they lived. What followed was one of the great survival stories of the age. The two men struggled south for months. Their watches stopped, losing all certain track of where they were. They shot walrus and polar bear to eat, and burned the blubber for warmth. When the winter caught them, they killed and ate the last of their dogs, and built a low hut of stones and moss and walrus hide on a frozen shore, and crawled inside and waited out the long darkness. Two men, alone, in a hole in the ground at the top of the world, sleeping nearly the whole day, through to save their strength, their clothes stiff with grease and filth. And then, in the spring, came a moment so unlikely it reads like invention. Out walking near their miserable hut, Nansen heard across the frozen waste a sound that did not belong there. A dog barking, and then a human voice. He walked toward it, a ragged, black, blubber-soaked, long-haired figure who had not seen another human being but Johansen in over a year, and met in the middle of that nowhere an English explorer whose own expedition happened by the sheerest chance to be camped only a little way off. The Englishman peered at the wild apparition coming toward him and asked carefully, "Aren't you Nansen?" And the stranger answered, "Yes, I am Nansen." He had been given up for dead. He came home to find himself the most famous man in Norway. And within days of his own return, the Fram herself broke free of the ice north of Spitsbergen and sailed into harbour. Every man aboard alive and well, her great drift complete, exactly as Nansen had said it would be, years before, when they had called him a madman. He had not reached the pole, but he had shown the world how the polar sea truly worked, and he had gone closer than any man before him, and he had come home to tell it. The pole itself was still out there, waiting, and the men who wanted it now were of a harder and hungrier kind. If Nansen was a scientist who happened to explore, the next man in our story was something else entirely. An explorer consumed, body and soul, by a single fixed idea. His name was Robert Peary. He was an American, hard, proud, and utterly relentless. And for more than 20 years, he gave his whole life to one goal: to be the first man to stand at the North Pole and to be remembered forever as the man who did it. He went north again and again, expedition after expedition, learning the Arctic the hard way, season by season, decade by decade. He learned his most important lessons from the people who knew that world best. The Inuit, the polar Inuit of northern Greenland, who had thrived in that frozen place for countless generations. From them, Peary learned to build snow houses, to drive teams of dogs, to wear fur clothing in the native way, to travel and hunt and survive as they did. He built his whole method upon their knowledge, and he leaned upon their labour and their skill at every step. And it cost him dearly. On one expedition, the cold took 8 of his toes to frostbite. They had to be cut away, and afterward he walked with a strange, shuffling gait for the rest of his life. When he understood what he had lost, he's said to have scratched a few defiant words in Latin on the wall, that he would find a way or make one. He pressed on. The pole had become the only thing that mattered to him, the prize for which he had already given so much of his own body. Over those long years, Peary built what he proudly called his system, a way of attacking the pole like a military campaign. Wave after wave of men and dogs would lay a trail and cache food along it, each supporting party turning back in its turn, so that the final, freshest team could make a dash for the pole from the furthest possible point. He drove himself and his men, and above all the Inuit who served him, with a ferocity that won him both deep loyalty and quiet resentment. He could be generous, and he could be cold. He took from the Inuit nearly as much as he learned from them, and not always kindly. But no one who knew him could doubt the iron of his will. And the Arctic, even at the very end, was still playing its oldest trick on him. On one journey, he believed he saw a great new land, far off across the frozen sea, and he named it and set it proudly upon his maps. Years later, when other men went to find it, there was nothing there at all. It had been a mirage, a phantom of ice and light, like the open sea and the false mountains that had fooled so many hopeful eyes before his. At his side, through much of it, was a man whom history would, for far too long, leave standing in the shadows. His name was Matthew Henson, an African American, the son of poor farmers, who had gone to sea as a boy and joined Peary as an assistant, and who became, over the years, the most skilled and valuable member of every expedition. Henson spoke the language of the Inuit fluently, better than any other man on the team. He was the finest dog driver among them, trusted and respected by the Inuit hunters as one of their own. He could build a sledge and repair one, and coax a team across the worst ice. When the going was hardest, it was Henson, more than anyone, who got the expedition through. Peary knew it and relied on him completely. And yet, because of the colour of his skin, in the world they would return to, Henson's name would count for almost nothing. In the spring of 1909, after more than 2 decades of failure and frostbite, Peary made his final attempt. He had a ship built specially for the work, the Roosevelt, that could ram her way far north and winter in the ice, giving his sledge parties the shortest possible run at the pole. From the northern tip of the land, a great party set out across the frozen sea. Many men and many dog teams, laying and stocking the trail, the support teams turning back one by one as planned, each carrying the others a little further, until at last, for the final dash across the last stretch of shifting ice, only 6 remained: Peary and Henson and 4 Inuit companions, Uta, Igingwa, Seaglu and Ukwea, whose names deserve to be remembered alongside the others. And on the 6th of April 1909, Robert Peary wrote in his diary that they had done it, that they stood at last upon the North Pole, the goal of his entire life, one at the very end of it. He turned for home to tell the world that the pole was his. He was about to discover that someone else had already claimed it. While Peary had been struggling across the ice, another American had been telling an astonishing story. His name was Frederick Cook. He was a doctor and explorer who had in earlier years actually travelled in the Arctic alongside Peary himself, and had once been counted his friend. And as Peary came south in the late summer of 1909, with his great news, the world greeted him with a thunderbolt. Frederick Cook had got there first. Cook announced that he had reached the North Pole a full year earlier, in the spring of 1908, and had only now made his way back from the ice to say so. Cook got his claim out first by a matter of days. The world, thrilled, crowned him the discoverer of the pole. Banquets were held in his honour, and then, almost at once, Peary's claim arrived, furious, wounded, insistent, branding Cook a liar and a fraud, and himself the one true conqueror of the North Pole. What followed was one of the ugliest feuds in the history of exploration. The 2 men and their armies of supporters tore at each other in the newspapers for months on end. Each called the other a cheat. The public split into rival camps. Learned societies and committees of Congress were dragged in to weigh the rival claims and to try to settle which man, if either, was telling the truth. In the end, the tide turned hard against Cook. Serious doubts emerged about his account of the journey and about whether he could possibly have done what he said. And worse, far worse for his credibility, a separate and famous claim he had made that he had been the first to climb the highest mountain in North America was shown to be a fabrication. His triumphant summit photograph exposed as having been taken on a minor peak far from the top. Once the world knew he had faked one great feat. It stopped believing he had achieved the other. Cook's polar claim collapsed. Peary was the man officially honoured in his own lifetime as the first to reach the North Pole. And yet, in the long years since, historians have looked very hard at Peary's own claim, at his diary, at the astonishing speeds he said he had made over the ice in those final days, at the simple fact that, for the last and decisive stretch, he kept no companion with him who was trained to take an independent reckoning of their position. The distances he claimed to have covered day after day were so great as to strain belief, and the proof, examined coldly, simply does not settle the matter. So we are left with a strange and quiet truth at the very heart of this great race. We do not know, we may never know, whether Frederick Cook reached the North Pole, and we do not know for certain whether Robert Peary reached it either. The two men spent the rest of their lives insisting, each of them, that he alone had stood at the top of the world. And the ice, which keeps its own counsel, has never told. There is one more wrong that time has slowly tried to set right. For decades, the world remembered Peary's name and forgot the men who had actually got him there. Above all, Matthew Henson. By Henson's own account, on that final day, it was he who had gone ahead and reached the spot first, planting his feet on the place they took to be the pole before Peary came up behind. Whether or not the party truly stood at the pole at all, Henson had been at the very front of it, and for the simple reason of his skin, he was sent home to obscurity while another man took the glory. Henson worked quiet, ordinary jobs for years, in a city that had no idea what he had done. Only late in his life, and more fully after his death, did his country begin to honour him at last, with medals and recognition, and finally a place of honour among the nation's heroes, his name set beside Peary's, where it had always belonged. The man who had been the equal of any explorer of his age was given in the end his due. As for the pole itself, that shifting, restless point on the drifting sea, it kept its secret a while longer. The first time human beings looked down upon the North Pole, beyond any shadow of a doubt, it was not from the ice at all, but from the sky. In 1926, a great airship floated across the top of the world, and among the men in its gondola was a familiar name from the far south of this story, Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian, who had already conquered one end of the earth and now gazed down upon the other. From above, the men looked down at the pole that had cost so many so much, and let their flags fall onto the ice below. And in the years that came after, others crossed the frozen sea on the surface to stand upon the pole and prove it beyond all doubt. First riding north on rumbling machines, and then, the very next year, on foot behind their dog teams, the first to haul themselves all the way across the drifting ice to the pole and be believed. They had finished at last the work that Nansen and Peary and Henson had given so much of themselves to begin. As for Nansen himself, he never returned to the ice. He turned instead to the troubles of the living world and became one of the great humanitarians of his age, leading the effort to bring home hundreds of thousands of prisoners and refugees and starving people after the Great War. For that work, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. The man who had once drifted across the frozen sea on a little wooden ship spent his final years saving the living far from any pole. The drifting ice carries on as it always has, turning slowly beneath the place where every direction is south. and the men who gave so much to reach it lie in their graves far away. In the warm and ordinary world, remembered now, most of them, more justly than they once were. That is where we will leave them tonight. Nansen on his drifting ship, Henson at the head of the sledges, and the pole turning quietly on the dark and frozen sea. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well wherever you are, and when you're ready, we'll go wandering again.